Thanks everyone for coming to tonight's screening. I'll be introducing our panelists of a sort, as well as the night in general. First of all, I should say, my name is Matthew Whitley. I'm an organizer with the Emergency Committee for Rojava, the group putting on this event, as well as with our co-sponsors at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. Thanks to Mary Taylor and everyone who helped put this event together. So tonight we're going to screen a short and a longer documentary. We'll have some short intro information about the Emergency Committee for Rojava and the film itself. Then we'll head over to the films, and afterwards we're going to have a discussion Q&A. Just one thing I'd like to note is, as well as having this outreach educational event happen, we also want to continue our work as an activist organization. I'm a student in the Cultural Anthropology program here at the Graduate Center, and we're hoping to start an ECR student chapter at the GC shortly. So if you happen to be affiliated with the campus, please find me afterwards if you're interested in taking part and joining us, but you'll hear more about that later. So our two panelists are Meredith Tax. Meredith Tax is on the steering committee for the Emergency Committee for Rojava, longtime feminist activist, writer, and the author of A Road Unforeseen, Women Fight the Islamic State. You might see a copy of the book in the back. And along with Meredith, we have Ozlem. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the College of Staten Island, also in the CUNY system. Her book, entitled Turkish National Identity and Its Outsiders, Memories of State Violence in Dersim, was published by Routledge in 2017. So both very knowledgeable, and they'll tell you more.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to give a short context, a brief context to the movie, to the film, because it's made for audiences that are familiar with the event, so I want to apologize for those of you who are already familiar with the context. But for me, it's always, even for myself, I take time to revisit, to remind myself, and to kind of, even as an insider in some ways, not to normalize the situation, because I actually grew up in Turkish Kurdistan, and so I was born and raised in a war, and then I realized that how much you normalize these things, and it becomes your way of life so much that you forget to take a step back and look. So I'm hoping that those of you who are familiar with the context can still have fresh eyes to think, to rethink, and to not normalize what has happened, and to also pay attention to the struggle that has been going on, but that has taken different forms, especially since 2015. So in the fall of 2015, Turkey declared a war on Kurdish cities that supported the Kurdish movement. So it's not all Kurdish cities, but especially those that were the bed of Kurdish movement. It bombed their homes, declared extended curfews, and so that people cannot go out for any reason, and they put snipers on the roofs, so anybody who were to go out for any reason could be shot with no question. And it shut water and electricity lines in these towns so people move out. So it tried everything it could do to displace the people and to once again empty the region and to kick its Kurdish residents out. The elderly, the children, alternative news obviously, they were killed just going to the doctors, just doing their regular tasks of going outside for a reason they had to use a white flag, and even that didn't work in many times. So even homes were bombed, so it didn't even make that big of a difference. If you didn't go out, even if you stayed in the curfew, you could still be shot. And it was a very extreme situation for these Kurdish towns, not one that they're unfamiliar with. They were familiar with similar dynamics, as I briefly will describe, but it was a new process, especially interesting following the peace process of the previous short era. So it was, why was this happening? And so among many of the destroyed towns where Kurdish movement was active was Sur. Sur is what the movie is going to be about. It's a UNESCO historic sites within the city of Diyarbakir. And it's actually important to know that Sur had an Armenian heritage, Armenian museums, and remaining even Armenians in the city. So at least the view and the look and the feel that there has had been some Armenian existence here, on top of obviously the decades of Kurdish culture that has made the town what it was on that day. So the whole neighborhood was destroyed. People were displaced. They went to other parts, but the youth groups, they stayed. They fought the state. And so I think this is important because I'm going to emphasize two things today to introduce the movie. One is power, one is the Turkish state and what they're trying to do in the region, but the other one is struggle, resistance. So because I think when we look at this, we don't want to victimize, we don't want to romanticize, we don't want to orientalize the Kurds, but we want to understand the reality and we want to understand their struggle, and as part of our group to see what they are trying to accomplish and why it had been so problematic for the Turkish state to attack them in such big force. So Turkish war on Kurds was not new, obviously. Massacres and forced displacements to exterminate and assimilate Kurdish population, especially was intensified in the 1920s and 30s when the Turkish state was being unified after the Armenian genocide of 1915. Kurds became the problem. So in the 1920s, 30s, there were massacres and displacement in these regions. Tortures and imprisonment against the Kurdish left in the 1970s and 80s. And especially the infamous Diyarbakir prisons. So people were familiar with state violence, they knew what it is, they felt it, they experienced it, and they knew how to fight it. And also, maybe most importantly, and that's an important context for those of you who are not very familiar, in the 1990s, where the PKK, the Kurdish Party, Kurdish Workers' Party of Kurdistan, and so when the war between the PKK and the Turkish state intensified in the 1990s and the PKK gathered such common popular support in the region, villages were attacked, especially the mountain villages. People were displaced. Millions of people were displaced during the 1990s from these Kurdish regions. They went to the major cities, they went to Europe, and basically there was a whole period of destruction of Kurdish villages. And interestingly, most people who were the residents of Sur during this period of 2015 war against the Kurds were those who were displaced from their villages in the 1990s. So they were facing another episode. So there's continuity in terms of Kurdish state violence, but there is also transformation of its forms of power and violence and ways of managing and governing Kurdish populations. And there's also transformation in the Kurdish struggle. So it was undergoing an important transformation. Their emphasis shifted from more national discourse to democratic autonomy and feminism and pluralism, and this was a big threat to the Turkish nation state. It was a big threat to the AKP government. So, interestingly, it's the same government which started a peace process briefly after the 1990s. In mid-2000, there was a peace process that was negotiated between the Turkish state. For the first time, they could say Kurds. For the first time, they could talk about some of these massacres to some extent, although I criticize that period and why it was happened to crash, obviously. But there was a peace process. Things were better for the populations. I think that's also, you know, for us academics, we do criticize things, but if you go there, it was more peaceful. People could breathe for a while, so it was important. And though, what happened? So in 2014, there were national, global, regional events that happened that ended the peace process. First, it was the national elections when the Kurdish party, pro-Kurdish party, it's a coalition force obviously with the left and feminists and other groups, so it's a very progressive party in that sense. They gained a lot of seats in the parliament. They gained about 13% of the votes, and AKP lost power. So nationally, this is what was happening, that they realized that the peace discourse and process wasn't benefiting the AKP the ways they were intended, because they thought, if we give Kurds the peace, they'll support us. But that wasn't really the case. When people could feel peace, they wanted democracy, they wanted more. They wanted self-autonomy, they wanted regional governance. So things didn't quite go the way the Turkish government expected. And so another important regional global event that happened was in 2014, the Kobani resistance against ISIS and the formation of Rojava, Democratic Federation of Northern Syria, further threatened Turkey. So things, again, were not going the way the Turkish government intended, so they shifted the discourse and going back to the discourse of war and terrorism and fight against terror in Turkey. And so for the people, this is the part, an angle from the power, from the state, what's happening in the region. The resistance and struggle has also transformed. People were asking for, obviously, language, education rights that they had asked for. They're asking for more. They were asking for self-protection, self-governance, autonomous decision-making, local control and pluralism, full citizenship for women, ecological awareness against the capitalist destruction of the Kurdish and basically a lot of the Turkish region that was destroyed environmentally because of the capitalist expulsions. So they were against all this. And when they were asking this, the towns that asked for this, the places where the Kurdish movement grew stronger, were attacked. Turkish surveillance increased. The youth were resisting. The youth, also, it's very important, I think, to understand that some of this youth were also those who were displaced from their villages at an early age. So they had anger, they had resentment, they were ready to fight the system that had displaced themselves when they were kids and now once again is attacking them and has killed them in Kobani and has supported the ISIS over them. So then the youth continued to resist. And as the youth resisted, the Turkish state increased its surveillance, increased its violence, continued to destroy and bomb the towns. The snipers shot at the elderly, the kids, whoever was out for any reason such as sickness, trying to go to the doctors. And they shut the electricity and water. They tried very hard to take all the citizens out so they could claim that those remaining are not citizens anymore, that they're terrorists. So the youth, the Kurdish youth, was somehow transformed into the terrorists because the youth digging ditches to prevent the military tanks from going in their neighborhoods made them into terrorists. So I'm not going to make it that much longer because you'll see the processes of violence, you'll see what people suffered, you'll see what people experienced. But I want to again call our attention to the struggle, to the message, to what they have been trying to build in the region. And I want to also, so for those of you who have been interested in Turkish politics and have seen this authoritarianism, the rise of authoritarianism, and somehow it's made into this thing as there's this old, crazy authoritarian guy who's equally repressing the journals. Yes, there is an environment of repression, but I think this movie, this film, is a good place to situate the authoritarianism in Turkey in the war against the Kurds. The rise of authoritarianism and dictatorship in Turkey to the non-acceptance of the ideas of Kurds and their democratic autonomy that they were trying to build in the region. So in the middle of war, they were trying to build, and they are trying to build, and that's what Meredith will talk about, the ECR, and they are still in Rojava trying to build and resist all the forces, all the odds that are against them. So thank you so much for coming again.
Hi everybody, I'm Debbie Bookchin, and it's really wonderful of you all to be out here on Friday night. Thank you. We really are thrilled to see all these wonderful faces. I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to be in the back of the room where we have a book table, and in addition we have Meredith's wonderful book, A Road Unforeseen, Women Fight the Islamic State, which really gives a fabulous history of the women's movement, the Kurdish women's movement. We have a book also by the New York Rojava Solidarity NYC group, Small Key Opens a Large Door, and it is kind of a compendium of articles. And then I'm also pleased, especially pleased, and it segues into the 2.5-minute short that we're going to see, to have just brought this book hot off the press back from London last night with me in my suitcase, and we have some of those. What I wanted to just say is that, especially just about the film that we're going to see and about this book, is that it really offers an excellent introduction, a very brief one in the case of the film, and a more substantial one in the case of the book, into what is going on right now in northern Syria in civil society, because we hear so much all the time about, you know, the women toting Kalashnikovs and the YPG and the YPJ, but this book really outlines how the internationalist commune and others in Rojava are trying to build a deeply social, ecological society, which is really one of the foundations for them to be able to pursue the democratic confederalism, the direct democracy pillar, and also the feminist revolution. So as you think about holiday gifts, I'll be back there and be happy to help you out. Thank you. Now we're going to start with the short and then move into the film on Sur.
سور خوش بود والا وارا خوش بود اتفاق بود ام شغال جمعه بون ام به هفرا کالو پیر بونه ام به هفرا مازن بونه
جیکی بینا ام بیشن کی برخودانیه که ام بیشن هفتن د سوره ده هبیه و جیانه کی هفباری د سوره ده هبیه و سور ام بیشن کی حتی ایرو 33 مدنیت دوی درادا جیان کریه و هبیه
ناوی خوا کدا لبرجین دیاربکر
تما ازارو بود دکتر ایسو خرابه به کیجا پارتی اقتدار و دادن دفی بیار یعنی امری بود پیجی چار انسان اردوغان خراب کرد حیالا خروجیانه
ناوی خوا کدا لبرجین دیاربکر گاوا گسته آزمان است تو خود گاوا
طالبی 20 سالی ورسمیش بوم ده ایرو امو خراب کن اما سبب بلکه ام نبینی 5 سال پاشه یکی ده به سری دیدی یا پی نو همو خراب کن tekrar bezendisi verip.
Lübürcin Diyarbakir Gavagu setiri Li azman astuha
Hi. It's going to take me a little minute to recover from that film, as it probably will all of you. And I just want to start by saying that the system that those kids in Sur died to defend is the same system as that in Rojava, a system of local municipal control and complete integration of women into the fabric of the way things are run, as you could see from the role women played. And these are very traditional women. You could see they all had their heads covered. But still, they are running things the same as the men are. And this is something that no state in that region or possibly anywhere can tolerate. So that's just the thought I came out of that with. A few of us started the emergency committee for Rojava in April, after the invasion of Afrin, because we felt an emergency response was needed at that time. And most of us had been working on Rojava support for years, but we felt that despite several publications, a number of protests, a network of interested people, U.S. support work for Rojava and the Kurdish movement had lacked continuity, consistency, and structure. The work had been confined to a fairly small demographic made up of anarchists and Kurds, for the most part, and needed more visibility and reach. Because despite the large number of Americans interested in feminism, democracy, and minority rights, very few even know where Rojava is. So in order to change that situation, we started with an open letter on Afrin, signed by well-known intellectuals and academics, because we wanted this call to be visible as widely as possible so we could attract new people. And on that basis, we pulled together a small core group who made a commitment and thought through questions of strategy and what we do next. And we decided we wanted to set up a membership organization, beginning with chapters based at universities like this one. This is for several reasons. Universities are full of people who are interested in learning new things. Many of these people are young and have energy, and some have flexible schedules. and they have an institutional base that gives them access to resources like this room. So we're hoping to build our first chapter at CUNY, like Matt said, and branch out to other universities soon. And we recently fine-tuned our mandate. Our revised mission statement and demands are on these postcards. And I'm just going to go through this briefly, because it is a different way of putting things together than we have had before. Partly because until the invasion of Afrin, it was difficult for us in the support movement to figure out how to bridge between what was happening to the people in Turkey, like you just saw in this movie, and what was happening in Rojava, because the US government was so intent on keeping them apart. And the people in Rojava felt that in order to get US support, we needed to keep them apart and to preserve what we can only call a framing, perhaps, that there was no relationship between the two movements, when in fact they're very closely related and believe in the same things and have pursued the same model. And people go back and forth. So we couldn't really figure out how to do that, how to bridge those things, until Afrin. Once Turkey invaded Afrin, the struggles were no longer separate. So Turkey has itself created a different situation from the situation we started out with. When we started out during the siege of Kobani, many of us here, trying to figure out how to work to support people in the area, after a brief media flurry that Ozlem mentioned with, oh, look at those pretty girls in uniforms, and people stopped paying attention, and most Americans still thought that all the Kurds they ever heard of were in Iraq. And the support work that started then was not very organized. There was no real, there were small local groups, there were protests at Turkish embassies and the consulate, there were people who went to volunteer for the YPG, and activists who went to see what life was like in the Turkish area or in Rojava and came back and reported to other anarchists. There were academic conferences, but nobody who wasn't an academic ever heard of them, knew anything about them. There was no real consistency or communications. And the fact that the US was supporting, after Kobani, was supporting the Kurds militarily was very confusing to some on the left who thought that anything the US had anything to do with must be innately evil. And so these people couldn't be people we wanted to support, or else the US wouldn't be helping them. When in fact the world is a more complicated place than that analysis would lead you to believe. So people were confused, and they were also confused because although the movement to support the Syrian opposition, the civil opposition, is small, it has a voice here. And that voice was completely separate from the voice of people who supported the Kurds because of the opposition of people in the Syrian, the opposition of people in the Syrian opposition to the Kurds, because they framed the Kurdish struggle as being in line with Assad's aims and not in support of them, which is, again, wrong. It's not the right reading of the situation, but it did confuse things. Turkey's attack and the invasion of Afrin in April 2018 made it clear how much was at stake. They took off one of the 3 provinces of Rojava. They've got it now. They're repopulating it with jihadis and displaced the Kurdish population, and nobody did anything about it. And our movement was not strong enough to even raise a very powerful voice to say this is terrible. But this has also changed the situation and created a new possibilities for us here to do different kinds of work. So I just want to go briefly through how the situation has changed since 2014 and then open it up and say a little bit about what we're hoping for. ISIS has been driven into the desert. It hasn't been destroyed. They're still going in and out of the area and laying bombs and stuff, but they don't have any territory anymore. This means that whether or not the US continues to give support to the Kurds also becomes a question, and it's a question that the Trump administration has raised. On the other hand, Turkey's behavior, not only in Afrin and not only against the Kurds, but against its own people and also even against the US, has been so off the wall that even a number of people in US elites and foreign policy establishment types are saying, oh, wait a minute, and starting to write articles about maybe this is not a permanent alliance after all, maybe we need to rethink this. Turkey has committed sins ranging from blockading all the people at the NATO troops in Incirlik Air Base and not letting them out during the coup to, getting in, arresting US citizens, getting in Washington's face by buying arms from Russia when they didn't want them to, and attacking peaceful demonstrators in DC and all kinds of other things. So a number of people who would not have said anything about Turkey before are starting to say, oh, wait a minute here. Now, also, as the civil war in Syria is drawing to a close, it becomes possible to ask, well, okay, now this war is going to be over. What's going to happen? Who's going to be at the peace negotiations? Who's in the Syrian opposition? Are people in the Syrian civil opposition being included, or only these guys who've lived in Europe for the last 40 years? And what about the Kurds? Are they going to be part of these negotiations or not? And what's going to happen to the area that they have been running essentially by themselves since 2012 and want to keep running? And another difference is that we have a different movement here. It's a new moment here in terms of the left that presents new possibilities. And even though this is a left that is not very clear about foreign policy and doesn't know very much about what's going on with the Kurdish model, they are young and interested in learning new things, and this opens the door to many, many possibilities for discussion and travel and meetings that weren't there before. And what is even more interesting is that some of these people are now in Congress and in the city governments in various places, and state governments. And so there are possibilities that open up of actually being able to possibly get somebody who might at least begin to understand what this is about to listen. Whereas before, the only people who were listening were people, a few Republicans and guys in the American Enterprise Institute who like the Kurds because they're good fighters. So we have new possible allies now. And while the divisions in the US states still make it very complicated to figure out how we're going to deal with Washington, at least we can start thinking about that in a different way. So here are some of the things that we want to address as the Emergency Committee on Rojava. We have a new list of demands, which are, we want to ensure Rojava's representation, I'm looking at this postcard, in the Syrian peace negotiations and work for a federalist solution that will preserve its autonomy. We want the US to continue military support for the Syrian Democratic Forces. We want the US to break the Turkish embargo and send economic and humanitarian aid to Rojava. This is one of the only places in the world where refugees don't get any aid because they're blockaded by US allies. We want the US to end the sale and delivery of weapons and intelligence equipment to Turkey because it's used against the Kurds. And we want to press for the release of Turkish political prisoners and the resumption of peace negotiations between representatives of the Kurdish movement and the Turkish government. So how are we going to, what can we do to make these things happen and to make people listen to these demands? Well, we're thinking in terms of setting up committees. Research and writing, organizing, advocacy, and political work, and chapters. And we want to break into little groups to set up meetings for these committees if anyone is interested after the meeting. Research and writing, we need to gather resources and educational materials. We have a lot of questions we need to answer. Maybe some of you know the answers to some of these already. We need to have more detailed information about Turkish influence here. Who's on the payroll of Turkey, besides a few well-known lobbyists? What legislators are on the payroll? Who in the US has investments in Turkey? We've been told by someone in Europe that there are pension funds belonging to New York City and the teachers union that have investments in Turkey. We need to know more about that and if these investments are still current. What about the Gulen network? How is that connected with the US government? What about Syrian opposition groups? Who is actually in the negotiations? Can Rojava find any allies among any of these groups now that the war is tapering off? We need also to know more, not that we think it's time to take this up, but so that we are prepared when it does come up, because it will come up the minute we start doing this work openly, is the terrorist list. The PKK, which is the organization that was leading the struggle in some way, if only ideologically, possibly only ideologically, through these kids who believe in those ideas. But why is it on the terrorist list? When did it get, how did it get there? It was on the terrorist list from the beginning, but in fact, most of the groups on the terrorist list are ones that have done things in or against the US, which is not the case here. So we want to know more about how that list got compiled and whose influence was at work. And the same with other questions that are equally relevant, like why is the CIA saying that PKK leaders in Europe are dealing drugs and listing them as drug offenses? Why last month were bounties put on the heads of certain of their leaders out of nowhere, at the same time that this organization is our ally in Syria? So these are questions that need research. In terms of organizing, as I said, we want to start with the chapter of CUNY, and we see our priority is starting by building a strong local base and then branching out. We want to have a national organization and network, but we need to have it real here before we get too far into the atmosphere. And to do that, we want to organize outreach campaigns to inform people in various sectors who we think will be interested about what's going on in Rojava and about the issue of US complicity with the Turkish war on the Kurds. And some of these sectors are Kurds, obviously, feminists, unions, churches and temples. We need to have a speakers bureau. And that means we need to train speakers so that they feel comfortable talking about a place that they may never have been and can go out to other schools and churches and unions and whoever and say, this is what we know, here's how we know it, this is why it's important. And we need to do events like this one every month or two. In terms of advocacy and political work, we need to establish relationships with some of our local and national representatives so that we can go to them the next time something awful happens and say, look, we talked to you about this last August. Remember you said we should come back when something terrible happens. Here we are. We need to identify our opponents on all sides and know their arguments, including our opponents on the left. We need to keep organizing protests. Probably we'll do this on the chapter level. And we need to do media work and writing. At the end of this discussion, we're going to break up into committees for those who are interested in putting their name down for some of these activities. But now, I think it's time to open this up to questions and discussion. So, Ozlem and Matt, could you come back up here?
I recently came back from a very intense tour of the West Bank, so my head is in a slightly different direction at this very moment in time. My question is for you, Meredith. I'd like to know how you got to be involved and committed to this cause. And it can't be that CUNY is the only seed that is advocating for Rojava and the Kurds. There must be other university groups at this moment in time around the country. Is there nothing?
I can speak to that
Okay.
I've been running some of the social media, so it's led me to find some other organizations. There's nothing that's, at least that I've found, that's very concrete at this point. I know Philadelphia has a solidarity network. There's a couple others, like even in New York, but they're very small. I haven't seen any that have garnered like a lot of attention, but that's just what I've found so far.
I mean, to that question, there's obviously some Kurdish organizations like American Kurdish Association. There has been the HDP, which is the pro-Kurdish political party, and they have some presence. We used to do work with the HDP on these issues. So there are some groups that we are trying to connect because we need to connect. We need to build solidarity among each other and with other groups in New York on other issues. So,
yeah, and along those lines, let me go back to the first part of the question, which is how did I get involved in this? Which is, I've been trying to figure out how we could build a feminist left for the last 50 years. And nothing I've seen has worked so far. This is the first time. And this is a whole other discussion, and one I hope we can have. But it has given me new hope that we can actually figure out ways to solve the problem and put women at the center, or women's issues at the center of the left-wing enterprise in this next period, which is where I think they need to be.
I was just wondering, as the mission, the Pentagon's mission in Syria, northern Syria, seems to pivot away from ISIS and more towards anti-Iran, and the SDF is going to be a part of that. It seems to be pretty clear how that's going to affect the demands and the mission of your organization. Thank you.
I don't think it's at all clear yet what is going to happen. There's certainly a lot of bellicosity and a lot of finger shaking about Iran on the part of the Trump administration. But whether that is going to be the enduring emphasis of U.S. foreign policy for the next period is far from clear to me. There's a lot of other stuff going on too. I think what the Kurds want is just what they were saying in the movies. We want our own space. We want to be able to run our own communities the way we want to run them without anybody else coming in and saying, no, you have to do it this way. They want to be able to elect co-mayors, for instance, one female and one male. The minute Turkey took over the areas where they had been governing themselves, they erased all the women's organizations, said the co-mayor system was illegal, and appointed their own mayors from the ruling party. So I think what the Kurds are the Kurds are not particularly interested in fighting anybody. They don't have to fight. They want to build. If they have to fight, they will. But it's not clear that they have to fight Iran at this point, and it's not clear to me that they will if they are persuaded to.
yes, and I think another thing to consider is that the use of violence is mostly in the form of self-defense, and that has been the case in the region for a long time now. So did the US use Kurds for its objectives? Yes. That's what they do. They use the Kurds to fight ISIS, and so they gave support to the extent that they gave ISIS. And will they demand other things? They might. How the Kurds will respond, I don't think we should guess that, because I think Kurds have also been producing solidarity networks with Palestine, with other places, with the repressed, with the oppressed. So I think their intentions internationally also lie in the good place. So it's, I think, good to think about the solidarity networks that they aim to build internationally.
They have made very clear statements on this subject, saying, our alliance with the U.S. is purely tactical. We need weapons. We need certain kinds of support. we have no strategic alliance with the U.S. government or U.S. imperialism. I mean, they say that.
What about with the Gulf and Saudis who have been giving them weapons more recently?
I can't hear you.
I was just wondering about with the Gulf and Saudis who have been giving the SDF weapons more recently.
I don't think that they are very substantial contributors to the SDF, if at all. They've been contributing to other militias that are now supported by Turkey. I don't know where this information comes from. Can we get other questions?
I mean, I just don't want to, it's not like to repress that, right? There's that question of, yes, you're allying with forces that have been known to be undemocratic in the region, and you do get weapons because you need to protect yourself. But I really want to call people's attention to that notion of self-protection, self-defense. Would I get weapons to protect my child from being killed? Would I get weapons from the Saudis? I would. If I want to answer your question very directly, I would. To protect my children, I would get weapons from whoever I want for self-protection. And they've made it very clear that they've been using those for self-protection, self-defense. So
I see many hands now.
First of all, thank you very much. As a Kurd girl, when I hear these words from you guys, the movie or your topic, it was amazing for me. Like, it touched my heart. During the whole movie, I was crying. It reminded me of my mom, my grandmothers, what I faced back home. I'm here now to talk about it. Actually, because my topic, I'm PhD student in international security and foreign policy, and I did many research about Turkey and Iran, and they deal with Kurds. My new research, I'm talking about Middle East stability and Kurdish question. And I always quoted one of the professors in the politics science. They say when we're talking about the Kurdish issue inside of Turkey and Iran, it is Kurdish problem. But when we're talking about the Kurdish in the region, Middle East, it is Kurdish question. So my research with all data that I collected city by city in Turkey is showing that what's going on inside of Turkey is about the inequality in this country. When you compare the data of GDP, comparing the data of the development process, education, health, you can see the huge gap comparing to the southeast of Turkey, the Kurdish region, with the other side of the Turkey. And same situation in Iran. You will see the data showing you this huge gap. So without considering who live in this location, in this geography location, you will say, okay, what's wrong with this geography? Why these people in this geography, this location, have this kind of situation of life? So you can find this government, Turkey and Iran, they failed to give this ethnic group what they want. The Saudi sent them weapon. I didn't know where he found this information. I never hear about that. But for the US policy, the only ally for the US, for America in the region now, exactly in Syria, are Kurds. Because the US cannot support like other group inside of Syria, because sharing the power between Russia and Syria and Iran, and Turkey's new relation with Russia is clear. So the only people now as allies, Turkey, US can support them is Kurdish group. But unfortunately, we see that US using them as a kind of the weapon or military force to attack the enemy. The enemy may be Russia or Bashar al-Assad regime, anyone who is standing against US interests. I don't want to go to all the detail. I just want to make a comment about that one, and thank you very much again for focusing this case and Kurdish struggle in the Middle East.
Besides the Turkish woman, where in the world you will find that kind of movement where the woman is in charge beside the Kurds? And another thing is, I just wanted to know how many of the young people that they were left behind, did they kill all of them, or some of them they are in prison right now?
Yeah, unfortunately, the young people that remained to fight were mostly killed, and the ones in prison are mostly the activists who were defending them and who were in public spaces, but the ones in the neighborhood where these fights, the street wars took place, They were mostly killed. And the women's movement, I mean, that is very strong and very hopeful, as Meredith was saying, in the Kurdish movement. And sometimes I hear from other people like this is a myth and that it's not all real. And obviously, it's the step in the right direction. It's not like all the women's issues have been resolved, but they care very much to hear the voices, to represent the women, to put women in representation, and that it is practiced really at every local level. And I think I want to just thank you for that question also, because the recent war against Kurds and the destruction of the municipal governments have been very much a weakening of the women's position in Kurdistan, because the co-mayorships were changed by state appointees who were all men. So they really, and local governance that were half women-men representation were all changed by the state, male state appointees. So the Turkish war on Kurds is also Turkish war on feminism and women's rights. So that's
right. They dissolved the women's organizations, like in places like SIR, and put most of their leaders in jail, including a lot of the HDP leaders who were women and feminists. But I think one of the things that makes them different from other women's movements I've seen, first of all, is the emphasis on self-defense for women, so that it's not just arms, but ideological self-defense. It's having neighborhood patrols. It's all, I mean, where there have been plenty of other revolutions where women picked up arms, but it wasn't for themselves. It was for the nation, for the people. And the other thing that's really unusual here is the emphasis on domestic violence, on stopping it, and stopping all kinds of feudal practices like forced marriage and polygamy. Those are made illegal. Those are not negotiable. And the domestic violence stuff is really interesting because these local communes function to some degree as sort of mediation bureaus or local courts, where if people in the neighborhood find that a neighbor of theirs, the woman is being beaten up by her husband, the commune has an autonomous women's commune that's part of it, that has equal say and more say over anything that relates to women. So they will go and pay a visit to this guy, and they'll say, you have to stop doing this. And if he doesn't stop doing this, they'll go and visit him again several times. And if he continues to beat up his wife, they're going to take him out of there and say, you can't live here anymore. And there will be all kinds of, attempts at reconciliation and reform, but eventually he's either going to have to change or he's going to have to leave. I don't know any other revolution that's ever done that with domestic violence. I know that, there have been periods in a few where some of this was done, but they didn't last. And this seems to be very deeply entrenched at the local level.
I just wanted to answer you with a quick note that there's a great book called Compañeras by Hilary Klein, which is about Zapatista women. And I would say that that's probably the closest parallel.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah, and they have communications with each other, too.
They do, yeah.
That's right.
So I just want to say thank you for most... I like everything so far. I like the film, I like the depictions, and I like the ways in which you organized this presentation. Extremely closely felt and very moving. I just had a lot of naive questions, totally naive questions. I'm one of those on the left who are always suspicious about the way in which the US tends to intervene in these kinds of issues. So I guess my question is okay. So I guess my question is in relation to what you said about the alliance with the US being purely tactical. Is there some way to elaborate upon that just a little bit more?
There have been statements that we could post or send you that say what they mean. What they mean, I think what they mean, not wanting to speak for them, is that they needed weapons and they need air support. And they also want certain kinds of political support they haven't gotten yet. Specifically, they want to be included in peace negotiations about Syria. And they want the peace process started again in Turkey, and they want the US to exercise its weight there. Now, in terms of the federalism thing, of course, the Assad government, and like every other Middle Eastern government, or probably anywhere, this is the last thing in the world they want, is autonomous regions, minority or otherwise. They want to be able to control everything, top down. On the other hand, I talked to somebody purely informally in the State Department about 3 years ago who said, well, of course we can't say this, and you can't quote me, but actually this would be the best possible outcome, is to have a democratic place that other people could go, or that could be an example to the rest of the region. And of course, with the understanding the US would have plenty of clout there. I mean, all I can say about how much clout the US would have and how much influence it would have is I think it's going to be negotiated at every turn. And that on the one hand, the Kurds look little and weak and the US looks big and strong. On the other hand, the Kurds are very united and clear about what they want, while the US is all over the map, and the Pentagon is fighting the State Department, and both of them are fighting the CIA, and the Trump White House is fighting everybody else, and the Republicans are fighting the Democrats, so it's not so clear that we're united and it's straightforward in our objectives. And I think it's just going to keep being negotiated. The last example of that happened in when the Turks invaded Afrin. The SDF said, you have to do something, you have to do something, you have to do something. Nobody did anything, and they said, well, we're going to have to withdraw our troops from the fight with ISIS and send them to Afrin then, and they did, which was not at all what the US had in mind.
Yeah, I mean, if I may also ask this question to those of you who are, and I would be concerned about US involvement in the region, but is the US, I mean, it's like as if the US is ever not involved in the region. Like, what are we doing to prevent US supporting the Saudis? What are we doing to prevent US supporting the Israel? What are we doing to prevent US supporting Turkey? And so like, as if it sometimes feels as if we don't have a problem with US supporting these forces, and we do have a problem when the US allies with an oppressed force. Like, so if we do all get up and start fighting against US involvement in the region and its support for Israel and Turkey and Saudis, I promise I'm going to convince the Kurds to not receive any US support.
Oh, I just wanted to note that we keep saying the Kurds, but one thing that I think is important about this project, the Democratic Confederalist political project, both in Turkey and Syria, is that it's not specifically an ethnic project. Of course, it comes out of the Kurdish freedom movement, but it's managed to involve a variety of leftists, internationalists, anarchists, Arabs, Turkmen, Syriacs, who have also participated in and embraced this model of kind of socialist radical democracy. And I think maybe that's the most threatening aspect currently. And as to whether there's a tactical relationship with the US or not, the politics and the ideology, I think, is the biggest indicator of that. And certainly if I were trying to win US support, I wouldn't frame my revolution as one that's inspired by anarchists and communists and the most marginal of political philosophies and anti-capitalist, in terms of the US state involvement. And they've never wavered from that line, and they continue to put those systems into place and try and build that revolution. So I think if we see that change, maybe it indicates something, but until now, that's always been the case.
That's on. Okay. I just wanted to say thank you for such an incredible panel, and the film was obviously very moving, and I mean, goes without saying. I just wanted to, and as for the initiative, personally as someone who was kind of involved in the first initiative, and this was always a huge debate about connecting, like the Kurdish freedom movement, like Kurdistan in Turkey with Kurdistan in Syria and the implications for that. So I'm really thrilled to see that that's going to be the case moving forward. And I think that'll change a lot in terms of our possibilities for allies and everything. I just, on a quick note, Meredith, you mentioned about the domestic violence policy, and it just, of course it doesn't just speak to domestic violence, it's like, rape and polygamy and child marriage and all of the things that the region is rife with. Were you speaking just specifically about Rojava, or you're also speaking about the municipality, there's, especially in the municipalities in Diyarbakir or in Sur, there's, the women have gone constantly to sort of these councils, as you're saying, and then I know that they will cut off the wage of the man and give it to the woman if they continue to beat them up or whatever. But that's just from a testimony. I haven't seen firsthand, so I want to hear what you have to say.
I haven't seen them firsthand either, but as far as I know, everything that they're doing in Rojava was also done in Turkey, and originally done in Turkey, because that's where all this started. But it's been crushed as much as it can be crushed. Obviously, you could see from the movie it has not entirely been crushed, and resistance will go on. But whereas in Rojava they have had 4 years of a free space to really develop the methods, and without having anybody on top of them telling them they have to stop.
Yes, it has been stronger in Rojava, but it's been practiced in Turkey, especially among the pro-Kurdish activists and pro-Kurdish party, HDP. I mean, the party itself even has known to, even renounce some of its parliamentarians for their personal lives, and so, and there's some things to discuss around that, but it's being tried. I mean, it's a step, and they've been trying to take that step in Turkish Kurdistan as well. So.
Yeah, kudos again. This is a great panel that you guys put together, a great event. Just a couple comments. This might be a little academic-y, but just on the comparing the Kurdish fight against women's oppression, there seems to be some parallels from what I read with Sendero Luminoso, not that you want to necessarily be in the same lane, but in the fight against domestic abuse, domestic violence, they kind of took a hard line. So maybe if someone's looking for a dissertation, that might be an interesting comparison. But my question was about, now there's the SDF. My understanding, the YPG is the major force in the SDF. So we've heard a lot about the popular democracy that has been organized in Rojava in the liberated areas. But how does the military arm operate? Do they operate on democratic bases? I mean, are they having popular assemblies to decide, well, are we going to send troops to Africa? And I didn't realize, I thought they had actually pulled out, but I mean, are those democratically decided upon decisions, or is it kind of the ruling or an elite within the military that makes those?
Let me start with that, and other people can chime in. There's the YPG and the YPJ. The YPG is a mixed militia, a mixed army of male and female soldiers. The YPJ is only women. Both of them elect their own commanders. There are women commanders in both. The commander who led the campaign on Raqqa was a woman. I don't know how they determine their tactical objectives and what kind of discussion leads up to them, but I do know that much. And that there's everybody who joins has to go through a political education process, that a lot of it is about women and about democracy in terms of what they're fighting for, and about pluralism, because they are trying to integrate not just Kurds, as Matt said, but to build a fighting force that is multinational and where everybody is able to pursue their own cultural objectives within limits. The limits that they run up against are ones of oppression of women and imposing things on other groups.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the, one of the biggest dilemmas is that this is taking place in the midst of war. So this is being practiced in the midst of war. So there is a lot that they try to do by use of committees and discussion and debates, but there are decisions that are taken or directed at the top in times of war, and if they need to attack somewhere, if they're under attack, right, they're not going to sit down for a council meeting. But I have to say that there is also what they're trying to practice in that case is that people are, everybody, including the commanders, need to answer questions, or if anybody has concerns, or if anybody wants to oppose something, that they try to make it, so that there is, what do you call it in English? So there is the, self-criticism, there's the criticism of actions, past actions, so there's discussions about the past actions and decisions that were made in the name of people, in the hopes that once there is no war, that all the decisions could then be made by means of the councils and by means of democratic autonomous bodies that decide on all matters is the future intention. But obviously things in the field sometimes, with the urgency of the matters, take different forms.
I think that it may be ironic that the possibility of Rojava making itself as unimportant as possible may be its best hope for the future. Because the Zapatista example is a very apt one in the sense that, the state had its counter and so on, but the stakes in the area, there are stakes for the state and capital there, but they're nowhere near the situation there. So the degree to which it can find its way to kind of, if it really wants to be autonomous, it's going to have to sort of evade and bury itself and deflect out of that circumstances. Now, history development may help that, but to be honest with you, that's very unlikely given the region. So it's got to think in those terms what will be, because otherwise, forget it. I mean, it's going to find itself bandied around. You don't have in Mexico. We didn't have Turkish. We have the U.S. saying, "Oh yeah, this is great. Zapatistas, we're going in, and we don't like the examples they're giving to Arizonan, Aboriginal, communities or something like that, right?"
I personally, this is only my opinion, don't think it's going to be very easy for them to be unobtrusive, because they're the only place like that in a region that's torn by war and full of dictatorships, and also has shown in Arab Spring that there are many, many people who want something different, and they're going to be attracted to this example like a magnet, as is only right and natural. And that's why the Kurds say World War III has already begun, that this battle is this struggle is going to go on for a long time, and not only in the Middle East, but certainly in the Middle East. And it's a struggle basically for democracy and women's rights, and it's going to be hard.